I don't think it was a slip when I said, who's the ex-CCI? Because there's no ex-CCI. There's one who's there as a job. And there are three of us here who look at competition law. But all three of us are concerned about a question which one of the ex-CCI raised in the last session, which was very, very relevant. And that is why he has brought this topic into the question of the larger framework of economic growth and development. Where do patents come in? Is it necessary that it should always be something within this country? Is there anything wrong with foreign investment coming in? And how does one look at it? He didn't get a good enough answer, I know. I don't think I can give him a good enough answer now, except to state that you are looking at patents and patent laws within the country from two sides. It is not only a question of encouraging foreign investment, but it is also a signal to those people within the country that there is a certain amount of incentive to go in for patents, for going in for innovation and for going for creation. So you have to look at the protection that patent law provides in terms of its externalities. And that's the comparative advantage I think this country has, because we did have a little bit in biotechnology and drugs, but I think it is AI that we have a lot. And Mr. Ganguly's work has been in that area to try and encourage a lot. So having stated this basic thing, when you're dealing with a larger question of economic growth and the industrial growth and the pattern that we have chosen, which is market-oriented, I think the focus of competition law and the focus of Competition Commission is on the end consumer. I mean, there's no point in getting confused, even in a platform economy, saying there are other consumers on the other side. That becomes a different transaction altogether. The focus is essentially on what the end consumer gains and what are the effects on the end consumer, and the Competition Commission somehow keeps missing the end consumer, and others also miss this end consumer because they get carried away by social forbearance, social responsibility. People are in the business for making money, and the Commission has to make sure that when they're making money, it is not at the cost of the end consumer. Yesterday, I don't know if you were here, but when I want to take up this case, I want to bring it up specifically and raise one or two points on IPRs and especially on SEPs and standard essential patents. Now, whether it is a patent holder, whether it is a manufacturer, both of them can only exist if they're able to price to meet the end consumer. They have to decide who the end consumer is. If they want to go in a vertically differentiated market, product market, to choose only the high-end consumer, so be it. But if they want to choose the low-end consumer, it is very much like Patanjali versus Hindustan Levers or what of them. It's the consumer. So no one is going to price it so high that it becomes out of the reach. And that's a very important focus that one takes, which as a competition law has to look at it, because that's the focus of competition law that comes in. So when you look at competition, do you look at ex-ante competition or ex-post competition? Ex-ante, there's a lot of competition. But ex-post, the moment a licensee has given his intent to take a license, he's in a monopolistic position. So are they playing games to get a better deal and claiming to be an end consumer when actually the end consumer is somewhere lower down the line? That distinction has to be carefully maintained. So while there could be a lot of ex-ante competition, there may not be so much ex-post, because there's no ex-post. The moment you get an SCP, you are a monopolist. So when a competition commission has to look into it, the question that comes up is not in terms of pricing or in terms of royalty, but trying to see what could be the abuse. There is no abuse in terms of dominance. The abuse is, has there been any restrictive clauses in the licensing part of it? And if there are no restrictive clauses in the licensing part of it, Everyone goes the way it has to be done. It is a process of negotiation. And let us not be slightly, overwhelmed by a nationalist feeling that our domestic manufacturers are fighting the big, bad international companies. It's a process of negotiation that takes place. If the negotiation is warped, it has to go to the courts. Now, where could there be some amount of restrictions happening and the Commission can look at it? One case has got withdrawn, that is the Micromax. Payal would be knowing much better about the other cases and where we take it up. But I also think the issues that could come up is that it is very important to understand what is discrimination and what is non-discrimination. This is sort of bandied about. And this becomes a very interesting concept, and I keep wondering that if someone is able to negotiate a different deal from the other, is the price discriminatory? Or what is the discrimination in the license? And another issue that has also come up is in the question of non-disclosure agreement, which I find it very fascinating that if one must know what the price of the other person is, does it help? I don't want to draw the distinction, but if I did know Rafael Indian Government was buying at 15,000 crores, is that information of any relevance to me? It's like Keynes when he was asked, how's your wife? He's supposed to have replied in comparison to whose? So, there's a question of you must know what is being done, and what is important is to look at the negotiating process, and that's where lawyers come in. Because they could be much smarter, they could draw better contracts, and the small world has to be looked into it. So the job doesn't stop there. And there's one more little point that I would like to bring up here, because this entire issue that came up is in the question of the smallest saleable unit as being the basis of setting the royalty versus the downstream price, a percentage of the downstream price. And from that, it went on to things like royalty stacking, and there's a question of pooling of patents and all. But let me take you back to that. If you were looking at any patent, and you had a chipset and on which patents are put in, the value that created by these different patents will differ, again, depending on which is the consumer that the manufacturer is interested in aiming at. So what I have as one of the most simple phone sets may not be what someone who could afford a Samsung or an Amazon at a higher level have. They pay for the value. So there is a certain amount of price differentiation that takes place. And in understanding, and I made this point yesterday itself, even if it is a value judgment, there are very clear-cut measurements of what is fair and what is non-discriminatory that has to be looked into. And I thought that this is more than enough, because when you come on to what your topic of today is, the grip on balanced framework, there is no balanced framework. Just the competition law has to help the consumer. And that's the end consumer. We have to get a grip on that. And that's the market orientation that one has taken. So if there is anything as an entry barrier that prevents this from occurring, it has to be looked at it. The definition of the market has to be looked at it. Yes, it's widened under a platform. The definition of consumers have to be looked at it. And also the question of what is harm and whom is harm occurring to. My younger colleague, who is now with the Commission, who's done a lot of work, and she's got a full, all her notes ready on her laptop. I now leave it to her to go into further detail of what she thinks the competition law should do.
But I was saying that you have all the answers to all the questions that people have to India's future and SAP.
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you, ma'am. First of all, I am coming here as a very, very last entry into the conference. Till about last evening, I didn't know whether I'll be participating. So my apologies if I'm not fully tuned into the objectives of this conference. So what I did was, and what the time I got before leaving my office was just to use the title of the session, which is Role of Antitrust in Nation Building. So the other discussions which have happened over a period of 1.5 days, I'm not privy to. So in some sense, that may be good because I'm coming from a very, very clean slate and with no preconceived notions or biases built in due to the discussions which have already happened here. But having attended these conferences earlier also, and I should thank Ashish for being persistent and persistent space, so I was able to make it. The focus of these conferences is innovation and competition interface, be it in the standard essential patents realm or be it in the high-tech sector. We at the Commission are grappling with these issues day in and day out because of several cases which come before the Commission. Every time, as an economist, I am asked to give my view, and this happened a few years earlier. I wanted to first understand what is the role of competition law, the goals accorded to this particular law. So each antitrust law would have different goals based on the letter of the law, based on how the law has been drafted. And so I always step back and go back to the preamble of the Act. Because the preamble of the Act, like the preamble of any law, sets the guiding principles for enforcement, be it in high-tech sector or be it in any other sector for that matter. And it is very important for adjudicators and at the Commission, for all of us, to understand the guiding philosophy of the Indian Competition Act 2002. First of all, the preamble reads, and I quote, "An act to provide, keeping in view the economic development of the country." So it makes it aptly clear that the greater good is the economic development of the country, which this act aspires to achieve through its instrumentality. And the instrumentality of the Act, again, we talk a lot about enforcement, but the instrumentality of the Act also comes through its advocacy mandate. So I'll not get into the advocacy mandate vis-a-vis high-tech sectors, etc., because by and large, the advocacy mandate is limited to sectors which are still highly government-dominated, and many regulations which are encumbering which do not allow the market participants to operate the way they should in a free and open economy. So high-tech sectors are, by and large, we don't have that problem, at least in India. We don't have that problem of government trying to vie for a space in the market for high technology. Going back to the preamble, so we achieve these goals through some means. What are those means? To prevent practices having adverse effect on competition, promote and sustain competition in markets, promote interests of consumers, promote freedom of trade carried out by other participants in markets. And all these goals need to be read in unison, because if you read promote interest of consumers vis-a-vis promote freedom of trade carried out by other participants in the market, there may be some disconnect. So case by case, this analysis needs to be done. That's point number one. Point number two is that the Indian competition law is a modern law, as modern as it could be, and it is as good as any international counterpart of a liberalized capitalist world, and hence it emphasizes and endorses a link between well-functioning markets and economic development. The legislative history of this law is also very, very purist. And when I say the legislative history is purist, I mean to say that what the legislators did not want to do is to mix too many objectives with this one single instrument of competition law. So if we read the Act and the other provisions of the Act, what stands out clearly is that the public interest objective, which lies and is in certain other acts, was beautifully carved out, where the public interest objective was left to the policymaker, where the policymaker would, in the interest of the public, devise policies, whereas the competition law was left to do what it was supposed to do, that is to promote efficiency. So there are certain provisions in the Act where the policymaker can carve out certain sectors in order to promote a public interest, so that there is no messy balancing of objectives when it comes to adjudication. And this helps us a lot when we are adjudicating in cases related to the high-tech sector and in general, in particular, and otherwise other sectors in general as well. Because avoiding this messy balancing makes the allows for the development of a jurisprudence which is far more consistent. Because if it is enshrined in economic principles of what markets are supposed to achieve, that is, markets are supposed to achieve efficiency, and in as much as the conduct is undermining that efficiency, that conduct needs to be frowned upon. So it sounds as simple as that, but when it comes to actual enforcement, and in intersection with the objective of economic development, this requires a very, very nuanced case-by-case analysis. And so lawyers who love, and this is a discussion I've had with Aviroop several times, lawyers who love rules, principles, rules to be applied, and the rules to be applied consistently across cases feel a little unsettled when those rules change on the basis of the facts of the case and the economics of the case. But in my discussions to him, I have said that it may be unsettling for the lawyers, but for economists, economists have a very coherent framework, and each case will show you that the framework which has been applied is pretty much consistent, and therefore it may be case specific, but the framework, if it is coherent and has a specific goal and objective clearly defined, you will see that that objective or that goal is being met by each adjudication the way it should be, it happens. Now, coming to the issue regarding high-tech sector and how the Competition Commission is viewing this, we have had a recent case and by the way, one is antitrust, and antitrust, I believe, when they wrote antitrust, they also meant mergers and acquisitions. It really boils down to the welfare standard, which has to be adopted, and as Madam Geeta Gauri mentioned, she talks about consumer, and she talks about consumer as the focus of antitrust adjudication. In two-sided markets, things get a little bit complicated because there are two sets of consumers, and in multi-sided markets, there are multiple sets of consumers. So balancing the interests of those consumers such that, and so it may translate into such that, eventually you have to make sure that concentration, so concentration is not bad per se, but concentration does not lead to a situation where the incumbent makes it impossible, impossible for the market to develop in a manner such that total welfare or dynamic efficiencies get compromised. So what needs to be seen is what is the welfare standard. If you look at the recent Android case in the EU, it clearly basically is adopting a standard where it is giving a weightage actually not to the consumer welfare. It is giving a weightage to the total welfare, keeping in mind dynamic efficiencies. The reason we see is that there has been also, after the Android decision, Google has so far said that this business model has been questioned, And this business model has been questioned, where they were giving free, open software. Perhaps now, with this business model in question, they may have to charge for that software. So the example which I took is to show you the differences in the results or the outcomes of adjudication based on the welfare standard which is adopted by the adjudicating agencies. And my last point is regarding mergers and acquisitions. Mergers and acquisitions need to be relooked, and even in India, the Competition Commission has been making these appeals to the policymaker. Given the notification thresholds, given the de minimis target thresholds, large amount of mergers and acquisitions in the digital arena get outside the purview of the Commission. And the right time to intervene and provide remedies to a possible ex post abuse of dominance is providing proportionate, appropriate remedies, and by doing a competition assessment at the time of mergers and acquisitions. And so therefore, there is a request to the concerned ministry that the de minimis target may be looked into such that digital acquisitions and mergers come under the purview of the Competition Authority.
So I think we have roughly 15 minutes for Q&A. It has been a fantastic set of comments, not only from various jurisdictions, from various types of digital economy, various features of the digital economy. So if the audience has any questions, if anyone wants to ask, yeah, can we have, if it'll be good if you could direct it to a particular individual then.
The question is basically to the two of you on the Chinese part. That's the first part. Where you now have the granting authority and the, of course, the enforcing authority under the same roof, especially through the Competition Commission in China. And you mentioned about it, you alluded to the conflict of interest, or possible conflict of interest. How does it operate? You said that you have the competition authority and the IP granting authority under the same roof, right? Now, there is an apparent conflict of interest. So how is this reconciled with, or how does it operate in China?
Okay. You can see it as conflict, but you can also see the joining of the two under the same roof to be an attempt to minimize or harmonize some of the potential conflict, because the grant of the patent is something that is not a concern of competition law, right? There are particular standards, etc., under patent law that need to be met before you can grant the patent. Where the potential conflict lies is in the enforcement. So where a patent holder exercises its right, is it an anti-competitive abuse as considered under the anti-monopoly law, or is it just an exercise of a property right that lies outside of the anti-monopoly law? And that's where the conflict can arise. Because SIPO is not just the granting; it has policy-making inputs, etc., and it is typically consulted as part of the decision-making process that is undertaken by the administrative authorities. So having them under the same roof could actually potentially resolve some of the differences in views between the person that has the IP focus as compared to the competition authority that has the competition focus, and where there are conflicts that potentially cannot be resolved between the two authorities then you appeal to the higher, because they all exist under the one agency. So ultimately, the person higher up in the decision-making tree will have to make that call and make that balance. And given that this is a administration for market regulation, that in itself helps you can help guide you as to how these conflicts may be resolved. It's essentially what are the interests of broader market supervision and regulation and how that might be achieved. I mean, this is still new days yet, but I think it actually helps to resolve some of the potential conflicts. And if anything, it will be resolved behind closed doors. So unfortunately, as an outsider, we get limited transparency and insight into this kind of black box mechanism.
But is it good? Because it is expected to be transparent.
Well,
So when you go into a black box.
I mean, this
situation,
is
it's defeated.
Chinese administrative decision-making policy.
I mean, they will.
Oh.
I'm sorry. They will say it's more efficient, but
And the other thing is, I mean, decision-making process at Chinese administration authorities is generally not transparent because everything is done by consensus and building. So actually, competition enforcement is actually one of the most transparent in a system that is largely not transparent. I know. I mean, that's the long and short of it. So, I mean, obviously there are many improvements to go and there are a lot of criticisms you can levy at them. Like, they are taking steps to improve that.
Dr. Wang, you want to add something to that quickly?
I may just add a few words. Yeah. The IP authority, the SIPO, the State Intellectual Property Office, is different, is separate from the antitrust authority before. But now, after the reconstruction of the Chinese government department, the two has a special link. At the administrative level, the new established authority, SAMR, has its position of ministry level. But the SIPO has just the vice ministry level. And the SIPO now is attached to the SAMR, or is subordinated to the SMR. But the SIPO has also a winner, because before SIPO just in charge of patent affairs, but now the SIPO both in charge of patent and trademark, and the trademark is the affairs of the SEC, the former of the SMR. So the two has a special links now.
I think Susan wants to add something to that.
Just a brief word from an outside perspective on those particular models that we've been discussing, and certainly quite supportive of what previous speakers have said. But whilst we have an instinctive reaction to think that this consolidation of functions might be quite unusual, if we look internationally, by far the universal paradigm is to have separate competition regulators from other functions, but it's by no means the only model. And just as a few benchmarks, and something that I have taken an interest in from a comparative perspective, is other models that might be pursued. So, for example, away from that idea of separate competition regulators, which I think we have in India, a contrast to that is to consolidate all competition and related functions such as sector regulation within one body. That's relatively unusual. Few examples: New Zealand Commerce Commission has done quite a good job that. Jersey, but because of the smaller economy, it makes efficient sense. And then what we have in the UK is quite unusual, with a concurrent regime where we have a mainstream competition regulator, knows about all industries, but we also entrust our sector regulators with the ability to concurrently apply competition law in their particular sectors. And I think that was the example I gave earlier. It's in telecoms, it's in rail, it's in payments, it's in all manner of industries. And I think that picks up on the efficiency point that was raised by the first comment, that because that regulator is particularly versed in that industry, they have a regular relationship, they may be able to bring more informed perspectives to bear. And it's certainly something that has been emulated around the world. I've done some work in Hong Kong recently, and their mainstream competition authority shares its role in the telecom sector with a telecoms regulator looking at competition law. So these are interesting insights elsewhere. Might not be blueprints to be emulated in other jurisdictions, but certainly if the theme of today's proceedings has been around balance, taking these insights and thinking, are they fit for purpose, given the size of the economy and the particular tensions it faces. The observation made earlier about transparency was well made, but I do wonder whether that is a specific phenomenon that we think about in relation to a particular jurisdiction, because it is quite all-encompassing. It may not necessarily be a criticism of the particular model that's been proposed, but a much more fundamental goal to be achieved across the administration as a whole. So just some interesting reflections from what I've heard from some other examples I've seen elsewhere.
Can I just add
Sure.
a little bit?
Yeah.
I think the point that you made, Balan, it's not just conflict of interest, because the patent creates a monopoly. And if it is under an anti-monopoly or a competition act, you are accepting and you're creating more monopoly. So you're really going in for more concentration. That's the argument. That's where the conflict of interest comes in. You see, it's that, that's the monopoly created. So if you have a competition part of the same group, they're in fact enhancing monopoly.
But I think going back to the point about markets, as I think we need to separate the question of monopoly, i.e. an exclusive right over an activity, which is what the intellectual property right gives, which I think we all accept as a given. Contrast that, though, with monopoly power, which I think we equate with pricing power over a relevant market, is actually the real challenge for competition law. And it's very tempting to jump from one to another and conclude that just because there is exclusivity over a particular activity, there is necessarily monopolization of a relevant market.
I think.
Can I just clarify one
Yeah,
thing?
but I'm sure there are a lot of more questions, but so if you could really be brief, both, Linus and you.
I guess just to clarify, just because they are under the same broad regulator doesn't necessarily mean that the competition authority will get input into the decisions made by SIPO in deciding to grant patents. The opposite is not the case, though. I mean, where the anti-monopoly agency is taking abuse of dominance potential actions against an IPR holder, then it will generally consult with
We want to know the firewalls.
transparency issues.
That's all we want, firewalls.
There is definitely, they formally go in different parts, but at the end of the day, yeah. No.
Linus, you want to add something, or should we move?
I mean, to probably change the question. I mean,
Yeah, okay.
we have discussed
Okay.
just to mention that it was interested in the mixing of IP and competition together in the same authority. The only authority that comes to mind is Indecopi in Peru. They basically do both competition and IP. Although, to be honest, because I've visited them, I mean, they have a very different function. So the people that are in the competition department usually don't talk between the IP one. So, it might be interesting more in the sense. Yeah, experimentation, as I said, is very good.
Yeah. Oops, yeah, sorry, Karul, go ahead.
So my question is directed to Payal ma'am and Geeta ma'am.
Can you see, I'm sorry, if you can't see
Well,
that.
I can't see that. The dais is in between, so you don't. You can stay there. So we have actually it has been a comedy of errors. Like in the past couple of years, we have seen the de minimis exemption from troubling the industry, wherein all the small PE transactions were becoming notifiable because of the inferences that the commission had drawn in the previous combination cases. To now the commission actually realizing that the ambit of the de minimis exemption is broad, wherein the new technology is not being tapped by the commission. Don't you think that more than tapping, big data companies, it is more important to also change the outlook of the commission with respect to these transactions? For example, like the market concentration that Professor Linos has talked about, that these companies don't work on present values, but what the future valuations, will happen with respect to these companies. Also, don't you think like in European Union, where there's a lot of accountability from the regulator towards the industry, the CCI now has to move beyond the pre-filing consultation and needs to take responsibility for the advice that it gives to the industry?
Don't call it a comedy of errors. It's a question of growth process. The de minimis, and also please remember when we had to get the mergers in and cleared, we literally had to woo industry saying, look, it'll be cleared in 200 days and this is how it is, and then itself the de minimis is very broad. And I think the growth of the commission is, and if you look at it, when you keep looking at all the merger clearances, the most progressive ones are the merger clearances. They've been extremely good. Perhaps I would have liked a little bit more detail than what has been given on the aspect of it. We've somehow become very conservative on abuse of dominance. And why? It's because we're misfired on the market, we get the markets wrong, we get the consumer wrong, and we don't realize that maximization of consumer welfare is also maximization of welfare. But the point that is really interesting is future valuation cannot be taken. You see, the point is this future valuation, if people are investing in it, they'll fall, that's their problem. But for the Competition Commission to take future valuation and stocks and capitalization of that is not the basis on which you have to go about it. And therefore, I think that while the Commission on Mergers has been going very forward, and that your argument that, this question of consultation should improve, give the Commission a chance. I think the Commission has really grown on this matter, and de minimis will keep changing, because what is considered a monopolist 30 years ago changed by the time the Commission Act came in, changed by the time I left, and is already changing now. So, and the European Commission's valuation and the consumer and that way a market, let's not get confused. I'm very clear. I've read the European Commission judgments. I don't agree with it. I don't agree with this concept, because for every transaction, even when it is a multi-sided market, it becomes a separate transaction and value is being added only to the end consumer. Let's not get confused on these matters. Be clear.
Sure. I think, and after that, I think Linus, and then we'll wrap up.
So your questions regarding the de minimis criteria and the Commission wanting a change in the target exemption for just a class or a class of enterprises that is digital. I understand your concern that PE investments, etc., would basically it will just flood the Commission with so many cases, and it's not worth the time of the Commission, and the Commission also realizes it. So we are not so gung-ho to evaluate each and every merger and acquisition taking place in the country. So therefore, a separate class, therefore, for digital. And why it has happened, and it has not happened, it has happened through a lot of deliberations at the international level with international authorities. And the heat is being felt not only in India, but all over the world, that this de minimis criteria is leaving out certain cases which would have been evaluated much tougher had they come under the purview of a competition authority. Avirup brought out a one pager way back in 2012 pleading, ma'am, Facebook and WhatsApp merger has not been notified. This should come and it should be notified. And he wanted opening into the press, and he wanted that article. Did it publish after all? Yes, it did. And so that's exactly what has happened. What has happened now is the mergers in the digital area is no longer between two companies in two horizontally same market. The merger is not about a messenger company with a social networking company both of them lie in different markets, no AAEC, no horizontal overlaps, shut the case. The issue is now it's data. The acquisition is not for the business, so to say, but for the data. And that is the time when the data monopolies need to be tested for and appropriate remedies being given. Having said that, it is very clear the German antitrust authority has in fact amended its law in order to get a due diligence of these kinds of mergers and acquisitions, in order to get the right definition of the relevant market. In India, luckily, we need not even amend the law. There may be some amendments required, for instance, bring in size of transactions rather than the thresholds as a basis for notification. But without an amendment, an executive order can change this. And I think, as Ines said, because in these sectors what happens is, ex post, when the harm has already been done, the companies and their practices are already so entrenched that everyone feels that this is the best way for any business to run, without realizing the kind of harm which is possible on account of huge amounts of data ownership. And data ownership is the reason why authorities are getting a little worried about it.
The only question I would like to ask, fine, I mean, this is inter-commission fighting. I mean, the question of data and the fact, first thing is that is this data controls something that has always worked out to the advantage of a certain company that has? Is there a lot of white noise that is? Is this a concern of privacy, or is it a concern of the competition law? And let us also go back. Business strategy all over. Now data is easier to get, and it's a question of access to it. So there are a large number of issues that need to be addressed on the question of data, and you can't take it on a blanket space, which is often what is happening, is this control of data, because everyone has access to data. And finally, when you look at data and you look at it in terms of the pricing of the data and also in terms of consumer taste, there can be variations that come. So, you know, this is a new area. I agree with you, this is really a new area that has to be got into. But I am not yet willing to step out and say that that is where it is necessary. One has looked at the German issue, one has looked at what the new data protection law has come up with, the act which has come out with the Sri Krishna report. I've also looked at Rama Vedashri's dissent order. See, there are lots of things, and data is something that can be sold, that can be bought. I think it needs a lot more debate on this.
The point I'm just making is that these acquisitions need to be seen with a lens of data acquisition, and I'm saying acquisitions, and it's regulation, by the way. It is prohibition of anti-competitive agreement, it is prohibition of abuse of dominance, but it is regulation of combination. So it allows for a rule of reason framework where you would look at the issues of what kind of monopoly power does or does it not? Is it dilutable, multi-homing, etc.? These are the things which are looked into. Does data ownership accord? So I'm not saying it's per se bad. It is a rule of reason framework. Merger and acquisition analysis and competition assessment provides for that rule of reason framework, which perhaps in an AOD case may be difficult given the way the abuse of dominance provisions have been written out, though I have a different view. Second, regarding data And in privacy, the Commission is very clear, and it has made statements in public forums that this privacy issue came up with one book by Maurice Stroock, Virtual Competition, and it just caught the fancy of all the lawyers. And in the Commission, we are very clear right now that we are not looking at privacy as an antitrust concern. So that's because one point was made that privacy can be seen as a quality factor, and so therefore a lot of ownership and how the data has been used may lead to problems regarding privacy, and that could be an anti-competitive conduct. So unlike German authorities, we are not looking at privacy as an antitrust concern as of now. So that's point number one. And so we give that space to the new Data Protection Authority, which has been conceived under the bill, which has been placed before the Parliament, or will be placed before the Parliament. Third, having said that, data monopolies and a bit of dilution of that monopolies through data portability, data sharing, there is a possibility to those kinds of remedies and would be looked at in a case-by-case approach.
A very quick question, Manveen, because we're really out of time.
I think I'm the only one who's left between the food and drinks and the ending of the
Between
panel.
this and vote of time.
So I can be blamed for everything today.
Give it together.
I have a small question for Dr. Gauri. Dr. Gauri, you mentioned about SEPs, right? And very quickly, I just wish to know what exactly is the Commission's stand vis-a-vis this entire situation with respect to the licenses negotiated as between the patent holders and the innovator and the implementers, right? Because you said, they know what they have to get and they'll not do anything that's going to be impossible for anybody to pay for, or for that matter, take into consideration the fact that this is something that's pretty much which is going to cater to just about 2% or 3% of the total implementers out there. Then they'll not do something like that. But we have had instances, not really in India, but predominantly outside of India, where this thing has backfired. So the Commission in that sort of a situation, I know India is pretty far behind in terms of facing these issues, but we do anticipate these things coming up in the future. So what exactly is the Commission stand? Are we not taking a proactive approach, or are we simply saying that, if somebody does it, we'll see them, rather than just sounding them out that this is not really going to be accepted by the Commission if there's no cap on such a behavior? Or are we just
decide on a cap?
Cap in the sense that,
You already got yourself into a situation of caps and all that. I've not even got into that.
yeah, so what I mean to say
Because I'm just trying to tell you that you're already preconceived how you want the market for innovations to work, how you want the market for the end consumer to work. Don't preconceive yourself. I'm only saying is that just look at it in one simple thing, just an SEP, and I'm only making reference to where I signed the prima facie order because R.B. Roop was not around to help me to rewrite it. But the basic point that comes up is that if you want to sell cheap phones and you have an SEP, will the patent holder or the manufacturer price it so high that no one buys the phone? And when you work it out in simple microeconomic theory, I have pointed out that if you price it as downstream price rather than the chipset, it works to the benefit of all the three players. So the question of caps coming in, the question of royalty stacking coming in, these cannot occur. It is the perspective that you take, the only perspective I will take, because my basic concern has been that I've continuously fought for saying, look at the end consumer, and don't take the manufacturer as the end consumer. But there is another perspective where people have said, if there is a case of an anti-competitive effect, or if there's a restriction on licensing which the manufacturer has to face, this is a barrier to entry which will eventually affect the consumer. So it's only to that small thing that the investigation has to go into.
So with that note, I will use my moderator's discretion to end the discussion. Hopefully we were able to show you how messy this construction site of nation building is, with the views and all of those opposing things. But hopefully you get a flavor of how innovation for shared prosperity for India, by India, and of India can shape in the next few decades. We have few tokens of appreciation which we want to sort of give to our guests. And I have to also thank Pradeep Mehta, who is Secretary General of CUTS, who have joined us during the discussions. Thank you, sir, for being here.
And a big round of applause.
Oh, yeah. Ashish, that should have supposed to come from you without me saying it.
Okay, I'll just take a couple of moments to thank all the people who've been a part of these two events over the last couple of days. To begin with, obviously the Office of the Vice Chancellor, Professor Raj, the Office of the Registrar, Dr. Murthy, the events and media team. We have two people here. We have this wonderful photographer, Sunit, who's been clicking all those photos for you. So if any one of you wants all those photos, you can, contact him. We have Vishnu, who was taking care of all the equipment here. All the speakers who took out time on, those weekdays to come and join us, because usually our events take place over the weekend. So this is the first time it happened on a weekday. So, it's that extra effort to probably leave your work and be a part of an event. Two people especially, Aruna Sundararajan, who was with us this morning, and Amrinder Khatua, who was with us last evening for the book launch. My entire JIRICO team, to begin with, Vishwas, Ashish, Indranath, and Avirup, and the editors primarily for the book launch and the wonderful book that matches with all the furniture that we have in this room. So the green books and the green furniture that you have. All the colleagues at JIRICO, so Joy, Vishal, Sarjan, Shruti, Arunima, Janvi, Kajal, Krishna, Isha, Ritesh, Navreet, Ranjan, Rajiv, Bhupender, all of you have put in extra effort to make sure that everything was absolutely smooth. And I think I'll just take this moment to especially thank our students who were with us today, for all this interval in time. And to a certain extent, I feel jealous, of the presence of such a huge audience, because we've been a part of a lot of conferences and we travel and we present. We never have such a huge audience, probably 10 people, 12 people. And here all these speakers had, good 100 plus people to speak to, which is an amazing thing. I mean, absolutely wonderful. So, and all, everybody from the very basic level of, making sure that all the things are in place, up until the topmost level, and of all the people who took out time out of their busy schedules, all the people from the industry, the academia, and all the lawmakers and the policymakers. Thank you. A big thanks to each one of you, and we hope to see you in the future as well. Just on a parting note, I would like to put this across that in the last 3 years, being a part of JIRICO and writing, researching, publishing, all of that stuff, we have managed to come out with 50 plus publications in less than 3 years. At JIRICO, that's the kind of output that we have had. And I'll end it on a lighter note. I was not going to speak about it, but Ashish nudged me to speak about it. So, that's that extra thing, right?